She thought she knew her husband, a struggling man barely scraping by. But what she didn't know was that just 24 hours ago, he'd acquired her family's multi-billion-dollar empire in a secret boardroom deal. She filed for divorce that very morning, citing his poverty as the reason. But the irony was that she was walking away from the richest man in the city. Her lover, his own best friend, promised her luxury and status, but what he was really offering was betrayal wrapped in designer suits. At the charity gala where her family's empire was about to be unveiled, under new ownership, she stood beside her new fiancé, glowing with pride, but she had no idea the stage was set for her complete destruction. Her lover approached her ex-husband with a glass of champagne in hand, but instead of offering a toast, he poured dirty water over the man who now controlled everything. The crowd gasped. She laughed. But when her ex-husband smiled and the giant screen behind them lit up with his face as the new CEO, her laughter died in her throat. Her lover went pale, her family went silent, but her reaction, what she did in that moment of realization, didn't just shock the room. It shocked her to her core and shattered everything she thought she knew about power, loyalty, and the man she'd thrown away. Melissa Hartford stood in the marble-floored lobby of the courthouse, her Valentino heels clicking against the cold stone as she signed the final divorce papers. Her hand trembled slightly, but not from regret, from excitement. She was finally free from Marcus Chen, the man who had promised her the world but delivered nothing but disappointment and empty bank accounts. "It's done," she whispered to the tall, handsome man standing beside her. Derek Stone, Marcus's former best friend, squeezed her shoulder reassuringly, but his eyes held something darker than comfort. They held triumph. "You made the right choice, Mel," Derek said smoothly, but what he didn't say was that he'd been planning this moment for 3 years. Marcus was never going to give you the life you deserve. Melissa nodded, but a small voice in the back of her mind whispered doubts she refused to acknowledge. She remembered the young man she'd married 5 years ago, ambitious, brilliant, kind, but that man had disappeared under the weight of failed business ventures and mounting debt. Or so she thought. What Melissa didn't know was that while she was signing those papers, Marcus was sitting in a mahogany-paneled boardroom across town, his signature drying on documents that transferred ownership of Hartford Industries, her family's multi-billion-dollar empire, into his name. Her father, Richard Hartford, had made the decision in secret, but his reasons were crystal clear even if his daughter remained blind to them. "Your son-in-law just saved this company from complete collapse," the lead attorney had said 24 hours earlier, but Richard had raised his hand for silence. "Yeah, Marcus isn't my son-in-law anymore," Richard had replied, his voice heavy with regret. But then he'd added, "He's something far more important now. He's the only person capable of saving what 3 generations of Hartfords built." Marcus had been working in secret for 18 months, using his connections in tech and finance to restructure Hartford Industries from the inside out. But he'd deliberately kept his involvement hidden, even from Melissa. He wanted to prove himself before revealing the truth, but he never imagined she'd leave him before he had the chance. Now, sitting in that boardroom with the weight of a multi-billion-dollar empire on his shoulders, Marcus felt hollow, but he also felt something else: determination. Melissa had chosen wealth over love, status over loyalty, but he would show her and the world what real power looked like. 3 weeks passed, but they felt like 3 minutes to Melissa. She moved into Derek's penthouse apartment overlooking the city, surrounded by luxury she'd always craved. But something felt wrong. Derek was attentive and generous, showering her with gifts and compliments, but there was an edge to everything he did, a performative quality that made her uncomfortable even as she tried to ignore it. "I've got a surprise for you," Derek announced one evening, holding up 2 embossed invitations, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. The Hartford Industries Annual Charity Gala, your family's biggest event of the year. Melissa's heart sank, but she forced a smile. I don't know if I should go. Things with my father are complicated right now. All the more reason to show up and remind everyone that you're still a Hartford, Derek insisted. But what he really meant was that he wanted to parade her around like a trophy, proof of his victory over Marcus. What neither of them knew was that this gala would be different from every other year, but the reasons why would only become clear when the lights dimmed and the truth came crashing down. The grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Hotel glittered with crystal chandeliers and the wealth of 1,000 influential guests, but Melissa felt out of place despite her designer gown and diamond jewelry. She clung to Derek's arm as they navigated through the crowd, but her eyes kept searching for familiar faces. Her father, her mother, anyone from her family who might acknowledge her presence. There's Marcus, Derek suddenly said, his voice dripping with contempt, but Melissa detected something else beneath it. Fear. She turned and saw him across the room, standing alone near the bar in a simple but perfectly tailored suit. But what struck her wasn't his appearance, it was his demeanor. Marcus looked different, confident, powerful, like a man who knew something everyone else didn't. He has some nerve showing up here, Melissa whispered, but even as she said it, she wondered why her ex-husband would attend her family's event when he had no apparent connection to Hartford Industries. Let me handle this, Derek said, but his voice had an edge that made Melissa uneasy. Derek strode across the ballroom with purpose, grabbing a glass from a passing waiter, but instead of champagne, he'd specifically requested a glass of dirty dishwater from the kitchen, a humiliation he'd been planning since the moment he'd stolen Melissa away. He wanted to destroy Marcus publicly, to grind him into the floor in front of everyone who mattered. Melissa followed reluctantly, her heart pounding, but she told herself Derek was just protecting her honor, defending her choice to leave Marcus for a better life. The crowd seemed to sense something was about to happen, but nobody moved to stop it. They simply watched as Derek approached Marcus with theatrical malice, raising the glass high, but Marcus didn't flinch. He simply stood there, waiting as if he'd known this moment was coming all along. This is for being a pathetic failure, Derek announced loudly, drawing everyone's attention, but before anyone could react, he upended the glass, pouring dirty water over Marcus's head and shoulders. Gasps rippled through the ballroom, but what shocked everyone more was that Marcus didn't move. He didn't wipe his face, he didn't rage or retreat. He simply smiled, a small, knowing smile that sent chills down Melissa's spine. Melissa laughed nervously, caught up in Derek's performance, but her laughter felt forced and hollow, like she was trying to convince herself this was justified. Then the lights dimmed, but they came back up, focused on a massive screen that descended from the ceiling. The Hartford Industries logo appeared, followed by an announcement that made Melissa's blood run cold. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the new chairman and CEO of Hartford Industries, Marcus Chen. The ballroom erupted in confused murmurs, but Melissa's world went completely silent. She watched, frozen, as her ex-husband, dripping with dirty water, walked calmly to the stage, where her father stood waiting with an expression that mixed pride and profound sadness. 3 days ago, Marcus Chen completed the acquisition of controlling interest in Hartford Industries, Richard Hartford announced, his voice booming through the speakers, but his eyes were locked on his daughter. He saved this company from bankruptcy with his innovative restructuring plan and personal investments totaling $2.3 billion. Everything you see here tonight, this event, this legacy, this empire, exists because of him. Melissa's knees buckled, but she grabbed a nearby table for support. Her mind raced through every conversation she'd had with Marcus over the past 2 years. Every complaint about money, every argument about their future, every moment she'd accused him of being worthless. But now those memories twisted into something unbearable, evidence of her own blindness. "No," she whispered, but Derek beside her had gone, completely pale, his confident smirk replaced by pure panic. Marcus took the microphone, water still dripping from his hair, but his voice was steady and strong. "Thank you, Richard, and thank you to everyone who believed in Hartford Industries enough to invest in its future. This company was built on family, loyalty, and integrity, values I learned from the Hartford family themselves, even if not all family members appreciate those values equally." His eyes found Melissa in the crowd, but there was no anger in his gaze, only disappointment and something that looked like pity. "I want to be clear about something," Marcus continued, but his tone remained measured and professional. "I didn't acquire this company for revenge or personal gain. I did it because Hartford Industries employs 17,000 people whose livelihoods depend on its success. I did it because innovation matters. And yes, I did it because I once loved someone who came from this family, and I wanted to honor the legacy she seemed so quick to abandon." Melissa felt tears streaming down her face, but they weren't tears of joy or relief. They were tears of crushing realization. She had thrown away everything that mattered for the illusion of wealth, but the real wealth had been standing beside her all along, wearing humble clothes and working tirelessly in secret. Derek grabbed her arm roughly, but his grip was desperate rather than possessive. "We need to leave. Now." "Don't touch me," Melissa hissed, yanking her arm away, but her anger wasn't directed at Derek, it was directed at herself. What happened next shocked everyone in the ballroom, but it shocked Melissa most of all. She didn't run away in shame, she didn't collapse in despair. Instead, she walked straight toward the stage with purpose, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown to judgment. The crowd parted for her, but their whispers followed like shadows. Marcus saw her coming and descended from the stage to meet her at eye level, but his expression remained neutral, guarded. "Marcus," Melissa began, her voice breaking, but she forced herself to continue. "I need to know something. When did you acquire the company?" "The final papers were signed 24 hours before you served me with divorce papers," Marcus replied quietly. But his words carried the weight of profound tragedy. "I was planning to surprise you that evening. I'd reserved the restaurant where we had our first date. I was going to tell you everything, how I'd been working behind the scenes, how I'd rebuilt Hartford Industries from the inside out, how every long night and every missed dinner was part of a plan to give you the life you always wanted." Melissa's hand flew to her mouth, but the gesture couldn't contain her anguish. "Why didn't you tell me what you were doing?" "Because I wanted to prove myself first," Marcus said simply, but his eyes held years of accumulated hurt. "I wanted you to be proud of me for what I accomplished, not what I inherited or what someone gave me. I wanted to earn your love and respect through my own merit." "And I threw it all away," Melissa whispered, but the confession felt inadequate against the magnitude of her mistake. "No," Marcus corrected gently, but firmly. "You threw me away. The company, the money, the empire, those were never what mattered. What mattered was that when things got difficult, when appearances suggested I was failing, you chose to believe the worst instead of having faith in the man you married." Derek appeared beside Melissa, but his presence only highlighted the depth of the betrayal. "Marcus, look, we can work something out." "Security," Marcus said calmly, but his voice carried absolute authority. "Please escort Mr. Stone from the premises. He's no longer welcome at Hartford Industries events or properties." 2 security guards materialized immediately, but Derek didn't go quietly. "You think you've won? You think humiliating me changes anything? Melissa chose me. She wanted someone successful, someone impressive. Someone shallow, Marcus interrupted, but his tone remained even. Someone who saw her as a trophy to be won rather than a person to be loved. Someone who was willing to betray his best friend for personal gain. Yes, Derek, she chose you. And that choice revealed more about both of you than any amount of money ever could. As Derek was escorted away, still protesting, Melissa stood frozen between her past and her impossible present, but what she did next surprised everyone watching, most of all, herself. She removed the enormous engagement ring Derek had given her, a gaudy 3-carat diamond that suddenly looked cheap despite its monetary value, and held it out to Marcus, but not as an offering, as a symbol of her recognition. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," Melissa said clearly, her voice carrying through the silent ballroom. But she wasn't performing for the crowd. She was speaking her truth. "I don't deserve a second chance. I destroyed something precious because I valued the wrong things, because I was shallow, materialistic, and blind to what actually mattered." Marcus took the ring, but he didn't pocket it. Instead, he held it up to the light, examining it with the same analytical eye he'd used to save Hartford Industries. Derek bought this with money he embezzled from Hartford Industries over the past 2 years. The purchase is documented in the forensic audit I commissioned. I'll be turning this ring over to prosecutors along with all other evidence of his theft. The revelation hit Melissa like a physical blow, but it also brought a strange clarity. Every gift Derek had given her, every promise of wealth and status, had been built on lies and stolen money. She'd traded authentic love for counterfeit luxury. "What do I do now?" Melissa asked, but she wasn't really asking Marcus, she was asking herself. "That's entirely up to you," Marcus replied, but his expression softened slightly. "But I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to run Hartford Industries with integrity and innovation. I'm going to honor your father's legacy by building something sustainable and ethical. And I'm going to move forward with my life, whatever that looks like." "Without me," Melissa said, but it wasn't a question. "I loved you completely," Marcus said quietly, but his words held finality rather than hope. "I would have given you everything, but not because you demanded it or deserved it based on your family name. I would have shared everything because that's what partners do. But partnership requires trust, loyalty, and faith. Qualities you didn't extend to me when I needed them most." Richard Hartford approached then, but his attention was entirely on his daughter. "Melissa, I need you to understand something. Marcus isn't just the CEO of this company. He's the majority shareholder. He owns 73% of Hartford Industries. When you divorced him, you walked away from more wealth than our family has accumulated in 3 generations." Melissa nodded slowly, but her response surprised everyone. "I know, Dad, and honestly, that's not what devastates me. What devastates me is that I had a husband who was brilliant, dedicated, and loyal, who loved me enough to work himself to exhaustion saving my family's legacy, and I threw him away because his suits weren't expensive enough, and his car wasn't flashy enough. I judged him by the shallowest possible metrics, while he was judging himself by the depth of his character and achievements." She turned back to Marcus, but she didn't reach for him or beg for reconciliation. Instead, she did something that shocked the entire ballroom more than any revelation about money or power. She bowed her head in genuine remorse and walked away. Not to Derek, not to her father's wealth, not to the comfort of familiar privilege. She walked out of the ballroom alone, leaving behind the engagement ring, the designer gown's train dragging behind her, and every assumption she'd ever made about what made a person valuable. Marcus stood in his corner office overlooking the city 6 months later, reviewing quarterly reports that showed Hartford Industries' most profitable period in company history, but success felt hollow without someone to share it with. He'd dated a few people since the gala, but nothing felt right. Every relationship seemed superficial compared to what he'd once believed he had with Melissa. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts, but it was his secretary with an unusual message. "Mr. Chen, there's a Melissa Hartford in the lobby. She says she doesn't have an appointment, but she'd like 5 minutes of your time if you're available. She says if you're not available, she completely understands and won't bother you again." Marcus's heart clenched, but he kept his voice steady. "Give me 2 minutes, then send her up." When Melissa entered his office, Marcus almost didn't recognize her. Gone were the designer clothes and excessive jewelry. She wore simple jeans, a modest blouse, and minimal makeup. But what struck him most was the change in her eyes. They held a humility and depth that hadn't been there before. "Thank you for seeing me," Melissa began, but she didn't sit in the offered chair. She remained standing as if she didn't deserve the comfort. "I know I have no right to be here, but I needed to tell you something in person." "I'm listening," Marcus said carefully, but he didn't move from behind his desk. The barrier felt necessary. "For the past 6 months, I've been working at a women's shelter downtown," Melissa explained, but her voice held pride for the first time since the gala. "Not as a volunteer or a board member, as staff. I empty trash, clean bathrooms, serve meals, and help women who've lost everything rebuild their lives. Women who remind me that real poverty isn't about money, it's about losing sight of what truly matters." Marcus's eyebrows rose slightly, but he remained silent, letting her continue. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness or a second chance," Melissa continued, but her eyes finally met his directly. "I'm here to tell you that you were right about everything, about partnership, about values, about the difference between shallow success and meaningful achievement. And I'm here to say thank you, because losing you was the wake-up call I desperately needed, but absolutely didn't deserve." "Why now?" Marcus asked quietly, but his tone held genuine curiosity rather than accusation. "Because I finally understand what you were trying to build," Melissa said, but tears spilled down her cheeks now. "Not an empire or a fortune, but a legacy of integrity. You saved my family's company, but not for glory or revenge. You saved it because 17,000 families depended on it. That's who you are, Marcus. That's who you've always been, and I was too blind and shallow to see it." Marcus walked around his desk then, but he didn't embrace her. Instead, he handed her a folder he'd been keeping in his desk drawer for 3 months. "What is this?" Melissa asked, but her hands trembled as she opened it. "The Hartford Family Foundation," Marcus explained, but his voice was professional, careful. "I established it using 10% of my Hartford Industries shares. Your father is the honorary chairman, but I want you to run it if you're interested. Not because of our history, but because the work you're doing at that shelter demonstrates the kind of values this foundation should embody." Melissa stared at the documents, but her tears fell freely now. "Marcus, I can't accept this. It's too much." "It's not a gift," Marcus interrupted, but his tone softened slightly. "It's a job offer, a real one with a modest salary and significant responsibilities. The foundation will focus on workforce development, women's empowerment, and economic opportunity. You'll have to work harder than you've ever worked in your life, but the impact will be real and measurable." "Why would you offer me this?" Melissa whispered, but she suspected she already knew the answer. "Because despite everything, I believe people can change," Marcus said simply, but his eyes held the same hope that had once made Melissa fall in love with him. "I believe in redemption, growth, and second chances, not in relationships necessarily, but in purpose and contribution. You made a terrible mistake, Melissa, but that doesn't mean your life has to be defined by that mistake." Melissa clutched the folder to her chest, but she didn't make promises she couldn't keep. "I don't know if I can ever make up for what I did to you." "That's not the goal," Marcus replied, but he smiled genuinely for the first time since she'd entered. "The goal is to become the person you wish you'd been all along, to build something meaningful, to prove that wealth without character is worthless, but character without wealth can change the world." "Can we be friends?" Melissa asked tentatively, but she braced herself for rejection. "Maybe someday," Marcus said honestly, but he extended his hand for a professional handshake. "Right now, we can be colleagues working toward a common purpose. The rest, time will tell." As Melissa left his office, folder in hand and hope in her heart, for the first time in months, she realized that Marcus had given her something far more valuable than money or status or even forgiveness. He'd given her a chance to rebuild her character, to prove that she was more than her worst choices, to create a legacy based on substance rather than superficiality. And Marcus, watching her leave, felt something shift in his chest. Not love, not yet, and maybe not ever, but respect. Melissa Hartford had been shocked by the empire she'd thrown away, but she'd been even more shocked by discovering who she'd become in the process of losing it. Whether that shock would lead to lasting transformation remained to be seen, but Marcus had built an empire on calculated risks and faith in human potential. If he could save a failing company, maybe, just maybe, people could save themselves too. The question that lingered, echoing through both their minds as they went their separate ways, was simpler but more profound than anything involving money or power. When you lose everything you thought you wanted, do you have the courage to discover what you actually need? For Melissa, the answer was finally becoming clear, but the real journey was just beginning. Marcus Chen stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office 3 years later, watching the sunset paint the city in shades of amber and gold. But his mind wasn't on the view. It was on the foundation gala happening downstairs. The Hartford Family Foundation had grown beyond his wildest expectations. But what surprised him most wasn't the numbers or the impact metrics. It was the woman who had built it. "Mr. Chen," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, but there was an unusual warmth in her tone. "Ms. Hartford asked me to let you know the ceremony is about to begin. She said you promised you'd be there for her speech." Marcus smiled, but the expression held complexity, pride mixed with something he still couldn't quite name after all this time. "Tell her I'm on my way." The grand ballroom looked different tonight than it had 3 years ago, but the differences weren't just aesthetic. Where once there had been champagne fountains and ice sculptures, now there were video screens showing the faces of women who'd rebuilt their lives through foundation programs. Where once there had been empty networking and performative charity, now there was genuine celebration of measurable change. Marcus slipped into the back of the room just as Melissa took the stage, but even from a distance he could see how much she'd transformed. She wore a simple navy dress that cost a fraction of what she used to spend on shoes, but she carried herself with more confidence than she'd ever had, dripping in diamonds. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her only jewelry was a thin silver bracelet, a gift from the first woman the foundation had helped escape domestic violence and find meaningful employment. 3 years ago, I stood in a room very much like this one and learned the hardest lesson of my life, Melissa began, but her voice didn't waver. I learned that I had spent 28 years measuring worth in all the wrong ways. I learned that I had destroyed something precious because I confused price tags with value, status with substance, appearance with reality. The audience, filled with foundation donors, program participants, and community partners, listened in rapt silence, but Marcus found himself holding his breath. "Tonight, I want to tell you about Shanice," Melissa continued, but her eyes found one woman in the front row, a young mother whose face appeared on the screen behind the stage. Shanice came to the foundation 18 months ago with 2 children, no job, no high school diploma, and an abusive ex-husband who'd convinced her she was worthless. She was sleeping in her car. She was terrified. And she reminded me of someone I used to know. Someone who'd also lost everything because she'd believed the wrong things about what made a person valuable. Shanice stood up, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling as Melissa gestured for her to join her on stage. Today, Shanice has her GED, a certification in medical billing, and a full-time job with benefits, Melissa announced. But her own tears were flowing now. She has an apartment, she has custody of her children, and most importantly, she has something no one can ever take away from her again, the knowledge of her own worth, independent of anyone else's opinion or approval. The ballroom erupted in applause, but Marcus noticed something that made his chest tighten. Melissa wasn't performing. She wasn't seeking validation or approval. She was genuinely, authentically celebrating someone else's victory, and the joy on her face was more beautiful than any designer gown or professional makeup had ever made her look. After the ceremony, Marcus found himself on the balcony overlooking the city, but he wasn't surprised when Melissa appeared beside him a few minutes later. They'd developed a rhythm over 3 years of working together, professional distance punctuated by moments of unexpected connection, like 2 people learning to dance after years of stepping on each other's feet. "You missed the part where I thanked you," Melissa said quietly, but she didn't look at him. She looked out at the city lights stretching to the horizon. "I didn't miss it," Marcus replied, but his tone was gentle. "I was in the back. I heard every word." "Did you hear the part where I said that the person who taught me the most about redemption was someone who saved an empire without seeking credit, who built a foundation without demanding recognition, and who showed me that real strength isn't about never falling. It's about how you stand back up?" Marcus finally turned to look at her, but his expression was guarded, careful. "Melissa, what are we doing here?" "I don't know," she admitted, but for the first time in 3 years, she met his eyes directly without flinching. "I know what I want to be doing. I want to be building something real with someone who sees me. Not the version of me I pretended to be, not the version I'm trying to become, but the messy, flawed, still learning version that exists right now. But I also know I don't have any right to want that, especially not with you." "You've changed," Marcus said simply, but the statement held weight beyond its brevity. "The woman who divorced me 3 years ago couldn't have built what you've built, couldn't have touched the lives you've touched, couldn't have stood on that stage and celebrated someone else's victory without making it about herself." "But is changing enough?" Melissa asked, but her voice cracked with vulnerability. "Can someone who hurt you as badly as I did ever truly make amends? Or does the past always define the future, no matter how hard you work to rewrite it?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, but when he spoke, his words came from somewhere deep and honest. 3 years ago, I would have said no. I would have said that betrayal creates fractures that can never fully heal, that trust once broken can never be completely restored. I would have protected myself by keeping you at arm's length forever. "And now?" Melissa whispered, but she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "Now I think about something my father told me before he died," Marcus said, but his eyes grew distant with memory. "He said that life isn't about avoiding mistakes. It's about what you build from the rubble of your mistakes. He said that the strongest structures aren't the ones that never crack, but the ones that are carefully, painstakingly repaired with materials stronger than the original." "Kintsugi," Melissa said softly, but Marcus looked surprised she knew the reference. "The Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold," Marcus confirmed, but a small smile played at his lips. making the breaks part of the beauty rather than something to hide. "I've been studying it," Melissa admitted, but she pulled out her phone and showed him a photo of a bowl she'd been working on. A ceramic piece she'd deliberately broken and was slowly reassembling with gold lacquer. "Every week in therapy, I work on this bowl. It takes hours to repair each crack properly. It requires patience, precision, and accepting that the repaired version will never be the same as the original, but it might be more beautiful because of what it's been through." Marcus took her phone, studying the image, but his expression softened in a way Melissa hadn't seen in 3 years. "How long have you been doing this?" "Since the day after you offered me the foundation position," Melissa said, but her voice was barely audible. "I needed a physical reminder that broken things can be repaired, but only if you're willing to do the slow, careful work of acknowledging every single crack instead of trying to hide them." "Melissa," Marcus began, but she held up her hand. "I'm not asking you to fix us," Melissa interrupted, but her eyes were fierce with determination. "I'm not asking you to forget what I did or pretend the past didn't happen. I'm just asking if you think it's possible, hypothetically, theoretically, maybe someday, for two broken people who hurt each other to build something new. Not a restoration of what we had, but something different, something stronger because of what we've learned, not in spite of it." Marcus handed back her phone, but instead of answering directly, he pulled out his own phone and showed her a photo that made Melissa's breath catch. It was a photo of him in a pottery studio working on his own broken bowl, but the cracks were already filled with gleaming gold. "I started 6 months ago," Marcus said quietly, but his voice held barely contained emotion. "My therapist suggested it. She said I needed to stop treating my heart like something that could never be whole again and start treating it like something worth repairing carefully, piece by piece." Melissa's hand flew to her mouth, but tears streamed down her face freely now. "You've been doing kintsugi too?" "Every Thursday evening," Marcus confirmed, but he finally smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Turns out we go to the same studio. The instructor mentioned last week that another student was working on a similar project. She said this student came in every Tuesday without fail, spent hours on a single crack, and never rushed the process, even when it would have been easier to just start over with a new bowl." "Marcus, are you saying—" Melissa started, but she couldn't finish the question. "I'm saying that maybe broken things can be repaired," Marcus said, but he took a step closer, closing some of the distance he'd maintained for 3 years. "I'm saying that maybe the strongest relationships aren't the ones that never face betrayal or pain, but the ones where both people do the hard work of healing. Separately first, and then maybe carefully, together. I'm saying that you're not the only one who's been wondering if kintsugi applies to more than just pottery." "I don't want to hurt you again," Melissa said, but her voice was fierce with conviction. "I would rather spend the rest of my life alone than risk causing you one more moment of pain. And I don't want to hurt you by holding the past over your head forever," Marcus replied, but he reached out and gently wiped a tear from her cheek. "I don't want to punish you for mistakes you've already spent 3 years rectifying. I don't want to be so afraid of being hurt again that I miss the chance to build something beautiful from the pieces we've both been carefully collecting." "So what do we do?" Melissa asked, but she didn't pull away from his touch. "We start small," Marcus said, but his eyes held the same determined hope that had once saved a failing empire. "We acknowledge that we're both different people than we were 3 years ago, but we also acknowledge that change doesn't erase history. We go slowly, we communicate honestly, we build trust brick by brick instead of expecting it to magically reappear, and we accept that the relationship we might build won't look like what we had before. It'll be something new with all the cracks visible and filled with gold." "That sounds terrifying," Melissa admitted, but she was smiling through her tears. "It is terrifying," Marcus agreed, but he smiled back. "But you know what's more terrifying? Looking back 20 years from now and wondering what could have been if we'd both been brave enough to try." "One condition," Melissa said, but her tone was serious despite her smile. "If I ever start slipping back into old patterns, if I ever start valuing the wrong things again, if I ever start treating you or anyone else as less than they deserve, I need you to call me out immediately. No protecting my feelings, no letting things slide. Real partnership requires real accountability." "Deal," Marcus said, but he extended his hand for a handshake, just as he had 3 years ago. "But the same applies to me. If I ever start using the past as a weapon, if I ever throw your mistakes in your face during an argument, if I ever stop treating you like a partner and start treating you like someone who needs to constantly prove herself, you call me out. Healing has to go both ways." Melissa took his hand, but instead of shaking it, she held it gently, examining the calluses he'd developed from pottery work. "So what does starting small look like?" "Coffee," Marcus said simply, but his eyes sparkled with something that looked like joy. "Tomorrow morning, 7 a.m., that terrible diner you've been getting breakfast at, before going to the foundation office. I'll meet you there. We'll drink burnt coffee, eat mediocre eggs, and talk about everything except work, just two people learning who the other person has become." "And then?" Melissa asked, but she already knew the answer. "And then we see if we can do it again the next day," Marcus said, but he squeezed her hand gently. "And the day after that. And the day after that. We build slowly, carefully, honestly. We fill the cracks with gold instead of trying to pretend they don't exist. And we accept that we might fail, but we also accept that not trying would be a bigger failure than any mistake we could make along the way." Melissa nodded, but she didn't let go of his hand. "Marcus, I need you to know something. Even if this doesn't work out romantically, even if we discover that the past is too heavy or the cracks are too deep, you gave me my life back. You gave me purpose when I deserved nothing. You showed me what real integrity looks like. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to honor that gift by becoming the kind of person who builds others up instead of tearing them down." "I know you will," Marcus said softly, but his expression held complete sincerity. "I've watched you do it every day for 3 years. That's why I'm willing to try this, Melissa. Not because I've forgotten what happened, but because I've seen who you've become in response to what happened. And that person? She's worth taking a risk on." They stood on that balcony for another hour, but they didn't kiss or make grand declarations or promise forever. They simply talked about pottery and therapy, about the Foundation's next initiatives and Marcus's plans to expand Hartford Industries into sustainable technologies, about their fears and hopes, and the small, careful steps they might take toward building something new from the ruins of what they'd destroyed. When Melissa finally left that night, she walked to her modest apartment alone, but she didn't feel lonely. She felt something she hadn't felt in years, genuine hope grounded in realistic expectations, excitement tempered by hard-earned wisdom, and the knowledge that real love, if they could find it again, wouldn't look like a fairy tale. It would look like two flawed people choosing each other daily, working through difficulties honestly, and building something stronger than what they'd lost because of everything they'd learned in the breaking. And Marcus, watching her leave from his office window, felt the same complicated mixture of hope and caution, excitement and fear. He didn't know if they would work out. He couldn't predict whether 3 years of growth was enough to overcome 3 years of marriage destroyed by shallow values and betrayal. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The woman walking away tonight wasn't the woman who'd divorced him for being poor. She was someone new, someone who'd been shocked by her own capacity for cruelty, and had spent 3 years building a foundation of character strong enough to support a different kind of life. The question wasn't whether people could change. Melissa had already proven they could. The question was whether two people who'd broken each other could repair themselves well enough to build something beautiful together, not despite their cracks, but because of them. And that question, Marcus thought as he turned back to his desk, was worth spending however long it took to answer honestly. 3 years ago, Melissa Hartford had been shocked to discover her husband had acquired her family's empire. She'd been shocked when her lover poured dirty water on the richest man in the room. She'd been shocked by her own shallowness and cruelty, but the biggest shock of all was still unfolding, the discovery that the person she'd thrown away wasn't just worth fighting for. He was worth becoming someone worthy of fighting for. And maybe, just maybe, if they both kept doing the slow, careful work of filling their cracks with gold, they might discover that the best version of their story wasn't the one that began with a wedding or ended with a divorce. It was the one that began with two broken people picking up the pieces and deciding that redemption, though terrifying and uncertain, was worth more than any empire could ever be. Tomorrow morning, 7 a.m., burnt coffee and mediocre eggs. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, Melissa thought as she unlocked her apartment door and looked at her partially repaired pottery bowl sitting on the kitchen table, beginnings were enough.